The first thing people noticed about the Caldwell plantation was its silence. Not the peaceful kind that settles over fields at dusk, but a silence that pressed inward, as if the land itself were holding its breath. In the summer of 1847, Georgia heat lay thick over the cotton rows, yet no birds sang near the big house, and even the cicadas seemed to avoid its shadow. Travelers passed by quickly, eyes forward, because everyone had heard the rumors and learned not to ask why the Caldwell sons never married, why children with familiar eyes appeared in the quarters and vanished just as suddenly. The lady of the house ruled from behind lace curtains and locked doors. She was spoken of with respect in town. Pious, charitable, refined. But on the plantation her footsteps carried a different meaning. Enslaved women learned to read her moods by the creak of the stairs and the way her voice softened when she spoke of bloodlines, of strength, of legacy. At night, lanterns burned in rooms where no prayers were said, and in the morning, new names were added to ledgers already heavy with secrets. Those ledgers were kept in a cabinet no one but her sons were allowed to touch. They recorded births like harvest yields, measured worth in flesh and future labor, and traced ancestry in looping ink that circled back on itself. The sons, pale and obedient, moved through the house, like ghosts bound to their mother's will. They never questioned why their reflections looked back at them from faces in the fields, or why the lady's hand trembled whenever a child was born with her eyes. By day, the plantation presented order. White columns, blooming magnolias, hymns drifting from the parlor. By night, the truth crept through the cracks. Women whispered warnings to one another, voices low and urgent, telling stories of children taken, of mothers silenced, of a woman who believed she could shape destiny by mixing blood as carefully as she mixed her tea. Some swore the house listened, that it remembered every cry and stored them in its walls. In 1847, a stranger arrived who did not know when to look away. With each unanswered question, the silence grew heavier, and the land seemed to lean closer, eager to unburden itself. What lay hidden on that plantation was more than cruelty. It was a deliberate design, a legacy engineered in secrecy. And once the truth began to surface, it became clear that no amount of wealth, faith, or fear could keep it buried forever. When the new schoolteacher arrived in rural Georgia in 1847, the plantation appeared no different from dozens of others scattered across the countryside, its white columns gleaming with an almost rehearsed innocence. He had come with modest expectations, hired to educate a handful of planter children and perhaps keep records due during the off-season. Yet from the moment he stepped onto the red clay drive, he sensed an unease that could not be explained by heat or distance. The Caldwell estate seemed to resist being observed, as though it preferred to exist just beyond the reach of scrutiny. Even the enslaved people who passed him lowered their eyes too quickly, their silence carrying a weight that felt practiced rather than natural. His discovery began by accident, the way most truths do, assigned to catalog old books in a rarely used study. He noticed a tall walnut cabinet sealed with an iron clasp, its wood polished far more often than anything else in the room. Curiosity, sharpened by boredom and isolation, compelled him to ask about it. The answers were evasive, offered with smiles that did not reach the eyes. When he finally found the cabinet unlocked one afternoon, the house empty and still, he felt as though he were trespassing into something that had been deliberately hidden from time itself. Inside were ledgers, dozens of them, each carefully labeled by year. At first glance, they resembled standard plantation records, inventories of crops, tallies of labor, notes on weather and yield. But as he turned the pages, a pattern emerged that made his hands tremble. Births were recorded with unsettling precision, Yet mothers' names were conspicuously absent. Instead, there were numbers, symbols, and notations about physical traits, health, and line strength. Some entries referenced the same surnames over and over, branching in ways that did not align with ordinary family structures. The records read less like a register of people and more like a breeder's log, cold and methodical. What disturbed him most was the repetition of certain initials tied to the planter family itself. The Caldwell name appeared not as owner or overseer, but woven into the lineage columns, looping back on itself in ways that suggested intentional design. Children listed as enslaved bore annotations linking them directly to the blood of the house. Though never explicitly stated, the omissions were louder than any confession. He realized that whoever kept these records believed that names could be erased, while blood could not. As he continued reading, marginal notes revealed a philosophy underpinning the numbers. Phrases about purity, control, and legacy appeared alongside calculations of profit and productivity. The hand that wrote them was elegant, almost delicate, yet unwavering. It was clear that the author did not see contradiction between refinement and brutality, between faith and manipulation. The ledger was not merely a record. It was a blueprint, a justification written in ink to quiet whatever conscience might have stirred in quieter moments. The schoolteacher began to understand why the plantation felt sealed off from the world. This was not a place that could survive questions. Every visitor, every outsider, represented a risk that the carefully maintained order might fracture. The Caldwell sons, whose presence he had found oddly muted and constrained, suddenly made sense in a way that chilled him. Their lives were not their own. They were instruments within a system designed long before they understood its purpose. The ledgers suggested that their futures had been decided in the same meticulous handwriting that recorded births and deaths without sentiment. Fear crept in alongside comprehension. He knew that knowledge itself could be dangerous, that reading those pages had placed him inside a secret that had been protected for years through silence and power. Yet the deeper he went, the harder it became to turn back. The ledger entries hinted at consequences for those who disrupted the order: sudden relocations, unexplained disappearances, notes abruptly ending mid-year. It was as though the book itself warned the reader not to linger too long on any single truth. Outside the study, the plantation continued its performance of normalcy. Hymns floated through open windows on Sundays, and polite conversation filled the parlor when guests arrived. But now, armed with what he had seen, the schoolteacher perceived everything differently. Every shared glance between enslaved children with familiar features, every rule that kept the Caldwell sons tethered to the estate, pointed back to those pages hidden in the cabinet. The land was not simply worked, it was curated, shaped by an obsession that demanded obedience from everyone within its borders. The realization settled slowly, but firmly. The records were evidence of a deliberate erasure of humanity, replaced by a system that reduced lives to variables in a long-term experiment. The plantation lady, whose presence dominated the household even in absence, had engineered something that blurred the line between family and property, turning blood into currency and kinship into control. By uncovering the ledgers, the schoolteacher had stepped into a moral abyss that could not be ignored. Because once seen, the truth refused to remain silent, pressing against him with the same suffocating force that hung over the fields, demanding acknowledgement even as the house itself seemed to close in around the secret it had guarded for so long, and was never meant to be read by anyone who might still believe in innocence. The whispers began in places where sound was supposed to disappear, carried on breath and fear rather than volume, slipping between the slave quarters after dark when the overseer's lantern was finally extinguished. They were not the kind of stories told to frighten children into obedience, but warnings passed between women who had learned that survival depended on knowing which truths could be spoken and which had to be buried deep inside the chest. The schoolteacher first heard them by accident, catching fragments while pretending not to listen, sensing that every word exchanged in his presence was weighed for risk before being released into the air. What struck him was not just what was said, but how it was said. The whispers were ritualistic, almost reverent, as though the speakers believed the land itself might punish them for carelessness. Names were avoided. Relationships were hinted at through gestures and unfinished phrases. When the Caldwell sons were mentioned, voices dropped so low they barely disturbed the silence, and eyes flicked instinctively toward the big house, even though its windows were dark. It became clear that the sons were not free men in the way others of their class were, but figures bound by an invisible leash that kept them circling the same ground year after year. The reason emerged slowly, layered beneath fear and resignation. The sons were never permitted to leave the estate for long, never sent away to learn trades or find wives as was customary. Any attempt to imagine their lives beyond the plantation was met with a tightening of jaws and a refusal to continue the conversation. The whispers suggested that their confinement was not for protection but for control, that the lady of the house had ensured their proximity to something she considered essential to her design. They were watched as closely as the enslaved people, though in a different manner. Their movements accounted for, their futures narrowed to fit a purpose decided long before they could object. In the quarters, children grew who bore unsettling resemblances to those sons, echoes of bone structure and eye color that could not be dismissed as coincidence. Mothers noticed it first, recognizing familiar traits with a dread that settled deep and heavy. These children were treated differently, marked not by kindness, but by attention, as though their existence required monitoring. The whispers told of how some were taken away from their mothers at young ages, reassigned without explanation, their absence leaving behind a silence more painful than open grief. Prayer meetings became another vessel for the truth, cloaked in scripture and supplication. Women prayed aloud for forgiveness they never named, for protection from sins they claimed were not their own. The language was careful, layered with meaning only those living within the system could fully grasp. The schoolteacher, listening from the edges, felt the weight of a shared understanding that did not need explicit confirmation. Faith was being used as both shield and salve, a way to survive what could not be escaped. The Caldwell sons themselves moved through this environment like men half awake, aware on some level that their lives were not aligned with the expectations of the outside world. They did not speak of the whispers, yet their discomfort was evident in the way. They avoided certain paths through the quarters, in the tension that crept into their posture when they passed children who mirrored them too closely. Whatever they knew, it had been taught as duty rather than choice, wrapped in the authority of a mother who equated obedience with virtue. As the schoolteacher pieced together these fragments, he realized the whispers served a dual purpose. They warned and they preserved. By keeping the truth fragmented and encoded, the enslaved community protected itself from direct retaliation, while ensuring that the knowledge did not vanish entirely. Each generation learned just enough to understand the danger, to recognize the signs, and to pass them on quietly. Silence was not ignorance here. It was strategy. The most chilling aspect of the whispers was their inevitability. No one spoke of rebellion or exposure. Not because the injustice was unseen, but because the consequences were too well known. The plantation's power extended beyond its borders, reinforced by wealth, social standing, and a carefully maintained reputation. To challenge it openly would invite destruction, not just upon an individual, but upon everyone connected to them. The Whispers acknowledged this reality without forgiving it, existing as a testament to endurance rather than hope. For the schoolteacher, this realization transformed the plantation from a place of hidden records into a living organism sustained by fear and complicity. The son's confinement was not an anomaly, but a cornerstone, ensuring that the system remained closed, self-referential, and unchallenged. Every whispered prayer, every warning passed in the dark, pointed back to a single truth, that the Caldwell legacy depended on keeping its blood and its secrets within the same suffocating boundaries, and that those boundaries were enforced as much by silence as by chains, tightening with each generation as the land absorbed their footsteps, and the night carried voices that refused to be fully silenced, lingering just long enough to remind anyone who listened that the truth was still alive, waiting, watching, and breathing in the dark. The discovery of the cemetery came not through deliberate searching, but through erosion, the slow betrayal of secrets by rain and time. A summer storm had torn through the far edge of the property, uprooting a stand of pines and carving a shallow gully where the land dipped toward the swamp. When the schoolteacher walked the perimeter days later, drawn by a need he could not fully explain, he noticed pale shapes emerging from the red clay, edges too straight to be stone and too deliberate to be chance. As he brushed away wet leaves, letters appeared, shallowly carved and worn smooth by decades of neglect. The graves were not marked like others he had seen. There were no dates of birth or death that framed a life, only surnames repeated again and again, Caldwell etched into limestone with varying initials beneath it, as though the carver had run out of ways to distinguish one from another. Some stones were small, meant for children, others adult-sized, yet the pattern remained the same, looping endlessly. It felt less like a place of rest and more like a ledger rendered in stone, each marker another entry in a history that refused to separate family from possession. What unsettled him most was the location. This was not the plantation's official burial ground, where enslaved people were laid to rest with simple wooden markers and prayers spoken quietly. This cemetery was hidden deep within the trees, closer to the big house than to the quarters, placed deliberately out of sight. The earth around the graves was compacted unevenly, suggesting hurried burials at odd intervals, as though urgency had dictated when bodies could be returned to the soil. As he moved among the stones, patterns began to emerge that mirrored the ledgers he had seen. The initials repeated in cycles, certain letters appearing far more often than others, some paired in ways that hinted at relationships too close to be coincidence. A few stones bore symbols rather than letters, marks that resembled those used in the plantation records to denote lineage and value. The realization crept in slowly that these graves represented not just deaths, but the consequences of a system that consumed its own. The school teacher imagined the nights when these burials must have taken place. Lantern light flickering through the trees, the ground hastily opened and closed before dawn. He imagined the absence of mourning, the necessity of silence. These were not deaths meant to be acknowledged, not lives allowed to leave behind a story. The repetition of the surname suggested an obsession with continuity, a refusal to let even death break the closed circle the plantation lady had drawn around her legacy. Rumors he had heard suddenly found their shape. Children who vanished without explanation, women who spoke of sickness that arrived too quickly and ended too quietly, Men whose names were struck from conversation, as if they had never existed. The cemetery was proof that disappearance was not accidental, but managed, a final measure applied when control wavered or utility ended. The land bore witness in its own way, preserving the truth in stone when mouths were forced shut. He noticed that some graves were newer than others, the carvings sharper, the stone less weathered. The system was not relic, it was ongoing. The idea that the plantation's darkest practices were not confined to a distant past tightened something in his chest. This place was still active, still breathing, sustained by habits passed down as tradition. The cemetery was not a warning from history, but a mirror held up to the present. As he stood there, the weight of the discovery pressed on him with an almost physical force. To acknowledge these graves openly would be to challenge the foundation of the Caldwell estate, to accuse a respected family of crimes that polite society refused to name. He understood now why the Plantation house seemed to loom even from this distance. Why its presence could be felt rather than seen. The power that had created this cemetery extended far beyond its boundaries, reinforced by shared silence and mutual benefit. The stones seemed to watch him, their repeated names daring him to distinguish one life from another when the system that created them had deliberately erased individuality. He realized that the cemetery's secrecy was its strength hidden. It could not provoke outrage, only rot quietly beneath the surface. The plantation lady had understood this well, choosing concealment over denial, trusting that time and fear would do the rest. When he finally turned away, the trees closing behind him, as though sealing the place once more, the schoolteacher carried with him an understanding that could not be set down. The cemetery was not just evidence of death, but of intent, a physical manifestation of a philosophy that treated bloodlines as resources and graves as footnotes. The land had been shaped to remember what people were forbidden to say, and now that he had seen it, he knew that every step he took back toward the house carried the risk of being absorbed into the same silence, becoming another name repeated, another initial carved into stone, another truth buried where it was never meant to be found. The enslaved woman who chose to speak had been known for her quiet endurance, the kind that drew little attention and survived by blending into the background. She had lived on the plantation long enough to understand its unspoken laws, long enough to know which paths to avoid and which questions to swallow, before they reached her tongue. When she began to linger near the schoolteacher during daylight hours, it was subtle at first, a glance held half a second too long, a pause where there should have been none. Those who noticed understood the danger immediately, because to break silence here was to invite consequences that could not be undone. Her decision did not come from recklessness, but from exhaustion. She had watched too many children disappear into the house and return altered or not return at all. She had buried grief so deeply it had become part of her posture, shaping the way she stood and breathed. The night she spoke, the air was heavy with the scent of damp earth, the kind that followed recent digging, and her hands shook as though the ground itself had not finished moving beneath her. She spoke quickly, as if racing against an unseen clock, her words spilling out in fragments that only made sense when assembled together. She told him of forced unions disguised as duty, of nights when doors were locked from the outside, and obedience was demanded in the name of survival. She spoke of the plantation lady's cold approval, of sons trained to obey without question, and of women who learned to endure because resistance brought suffering not just upon themselves, but upon their children. Her voice never rose above a whisper, yet every word landed with the weight of confession, carrying truths that had been passed down through gestures and warnings rather than speech. The letter she pressed into his hand was written in uneven script, ink smeared with red clay and something darker. It named names that were never written elsewhere, described events that had been erased from official record, and pleaded not for rescue but for remembrance. She knew, even as she spoke, that survival after truth was unlikely. Her eyes held no illusion of escape, only a fierce insistence that what she knew must exist beyond her own body, that the truth should outlive the silence that had protected the plantation for so long. By morning, she was gone. No explanation was offered, no questions tolerated. Her absence was folded into the daily routine, as though she had never existed, her name avoided with practiced ease. Those who knew what had happened lowered their eyes and tightened their mouths, understanding that grief itself could be dangerous if displayed too openly. The quarters absorbed the loss the way they had absorbed so many others, with a quiet that felt heavier for knowing exactly what it concealed. The schoolteacher searched for her without asking directly, his concern disguised as routine inquiry, but every path led to a wall of polite ignorance. Overseers shrugged. The lady of the house expressed mild surprise, and the sons avoided his gaze entirely. The message was clear: disappearance was not an anomaly here, but a tool. The plantation did not punish loudly, it erased. To remove someone completely was more effective than any public display of violence, because it taught everyone else that resistance did not even earn the dignity of acknowledgement. The letter became both burden and lifeline. He hid it among his belongings, rereading it at night by candlelight, committing its contents to memory in case the paper itself was taken from him. Each sentence deepened his understanding of the system he had only glimpsed through records and whispers. This was not chaos or cruelty born of impulse. It was organized, justified, and sustained by belief. The woman's words revealed the emotional cost of that belief, the way it hollowed people from the inside until endurance became indistinguishable from complicity. Fear followed him more closely after her disappearance. Every sound in the house seemed amplified, every look loaded with meaning. He realized how carefully he was being watched, how knowledge itself had marked him. The plantation closed ranks, its routines tightening like a noose, as if aware that something dangerous had been exchanged. He understood now why others had chosen silence, why whispers rarely solidified into action. The cost of speaking was not abstract. It had a face, a voice, and now an absence. Yet the woman's defiance lingered. Her letter existed, her words had been heard, and that alone disrupted the plantation's carefully maintained order. The system depended on the belief that resistance was futile, that truth could be buried so completely it would never resurface. By choosing to speak, she had challenged that belief, even if the immediate result was her removal. Her courage introduced an element the plantation could not fully control: memory carried by someone who was not supposed to have it. As days passed, the schoolteacher felt the weight of responsibility settle over him. He carried not only his own fear, but the knowledge that someone had trusted him with their final act of agency. The plantation's power lay in its ability to make people disappear without trace, but the letter ensured that this disappearance was incomplete. It connected the whispered prayers, the ledgers, and the hidden graves into a single narrative that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. The land itself seemed altered by her absence, as though it recognized the injustice and held it close. Paths felt narrower, shadows longer, the air more oppressive. Every step he took across the plantation reminded him that the truth was now moving with him, vulnerable yet persistent. The woman's voice echoed in his thoughts, not as a plea for rescue, but as a demand that what had been done be seen and carried forward. even if justice itself remained out of reach, even if the price of knowing continued to rise, even if the plantation responded the only way it knew how, by tightening its grip and waiting for silence to do what it had always done best, consume those who dared to speak and pretend they had never been there. The reckoning did not arrive with shouts or sudden violence, but with doors opening that had never been meant to open. It began on a morning like any other, the house bathed in filtered sunlight, its polished floors reflecting an image of order that had been carefully maintained for decades. The schoolteacher noticed first that the locks were missing from certain rooms, the iron fixtures removed as though they had never been there. Servants moved differently through the halls, slower, uncertain, as if the structure that governed their movements had shifted in some subtle but irreversible way. The plantation lady had fallen ill, her authority weakened by a body that no longer obeyed her will as completely as others had. With her confinement came the loosening of boundaries she had enforced through presence alone. Rooms once sealed were now accessible under the pretense of cleaning, of airing out spaces long neglected. It was in these rooms that the house finally spoke, revealing what it had absorbed over years of whispered orders, controlled births, and calculated silences. The schoolteacher entered one such room late in the afternoon, guided by instinct rather than permission. The air was stale, thick with the smell of old paper and dried herbs. Cabinets lined the walls, their contents spilling out where locks had been broken or removed. Inside were objects that transformed suspicion into certainty, personal items labeled with initials that matched the graves, clothing preserved long after its owners had vanished, letters never sent, journals written in the same elegant hand as the ledgers but more revealing, less restrained. These journals did not deny what had been done. They justified it. The plantation lady had written of destiny and stewardship, of her belief that she had been chosen to shape a lineage that would endure beyond the fragility of ordinary inheritance. She described blood as something that could be refined, directed, improved through careful control. Her sons appeared in these pages not as individuals, but as instruments, extensions of her will necessary to sustain the design she had imposed upon the land and its people. As these words surfaced, the house itself seemed complicit, its walls bearing marks where furniture had been moved repeatedly, floors worn down by pacing feet, ceilings stained by years of lamplight burning through nights of decision. Every space revealed traces of a life lived in secrecy, of acts repeated so often they had become routine. The grandeur of the plantation no longer masked its purpose, it framed it, emphasizing how cruelty had been integrated seamlessly into daily life. The sons reacted differently as the truth emerged. One withdrew entirely, retreating into silence that bordered on collapse, his obedience unraveling now that the authority behind it weakened. Another raged, not against the system itself, but against the exposure, terrified of what life beyond the plantation might demand of him. Neither could fully escape the realization that their identities had been shaped by something monstrous, that their inheritance was not just land and name, but complicity written into their blood. Among the enslaved community, the opening of the house changed the atmosphere in ways both subtle and profound. There was no celebration, no sense of victory, only a cautious awareness that something long hidden was no longer sealed. People watched the big house more closely now, noticing movements that had once gone unquestioned. The whispers shifted in tone, carrying not just warning but recognition. The truth, once fragmented and encoded, had begun to coalesce into something solid enough to acknowledge. The plantation's reputation beyond its borders began to fray as well. Visitors sensed the tension, the absence of its former certainty. Rumors spread more freely now, uncontained by the confidence that had once silenced them. The idea that something was wrong here no longer felt like a dangerous thought, but an obvious one. The land itself seemed to participate in this exposure, storms damaging outbuildings, paths eroding, the hidden cemetery inching closer to discovery with each heavy rain. For the schoolteacher, the reckoning was internal as much as external. He understood that uncovering the truth did not guarantee justice, that systems built over generations did not collapse simply because they were seen. Yet the opening of those rooms had altered the balance irrevocably. The plantation could no longer rely solely on silence, because silence had been broken by evidence that refused to be erased. The house had borne witness, and now it was testifying through what it revealed. The plantation lady's illness deepened, her control slipping further each day. In her absence from the center of power, the structure she had engineered began to strain under its own weight. Decisions went unmade, routines faltered, and the precise order she had demanded started to dissolve. What she had believed eternal proved fragile, once the force sustaining it weakened, exposing how much of its strength had come from fear rather than inevitability. As night fell on the estate, the house creaked and settled like a living thing, adjusting to a new state of being. Shadows stretched across hallways that had once been meticulously controlled, and the air carried a sense of anticipation rather than dread. The truth had not yet delivered justice, but it had introduced instability, and instability was something the plantation had never been designed to withstand. The legacy that had been engineered through blood and silence now faced something it could not calculate or contain, a future shaped not by deliberate design, but by exposure, memory, and the slow, relentless unraveling of a system that had depended on remaining unseen, its walls finally unable to hold what they had hidden for so long. The sons did not inherit what they believed they would. One left, disappearing into a life defined by shame and denial, never able to fully outrun the knowledge of who he had been shaped to become. The other remained, trapped not by chains but by memory, walking the grounds like a man haunted by reflections he could no longer ignore. The house did not obey him the way it had obeyed his mother. Doors stayed open, and servants met his gaze without flinching. Among the enslaved, change was slow and uneven, but something fundamental had shifted. The truth had been spoken, written, remembered. Children grew without being pulled into the house under false pretenses. The whispers softened, losing their sharp edge of terror, becoming instead stories told to ensure that what had happened would not be repeated. Memory became a form of resistance, passed down deliberately rather than hidden. The hidden cemetery was eventually found, its stones exposed fully to daylight. Names were read aloud for the first time, initials traced by hands that trembled with grief and recognition. The land, long forced to carry its secrets alone, was allowed to release them. Nothing could restore the lives taken, or undo the suffering engineered there, but acknowledgement settled over the ground like a long-delayed exhale. The plantation itself faded into decay. Paint peeled, roofs sagged, and vines reclaimed the columns that had once symbolized power. Travelers no longer hurried past out of fear, but slowed to stare at the ruin, sensing that something terrible had lived and died there. The silence remained, but it was no longer enforced. It was the quiet of aftermath, of a place that had exhausted its ability to dominate. In time, the story survived not as legend but as warning. It lived in fragments, in court records incomplete yet damning, in family histories that could not fully hide their origins, in the memories of descendants who felt its weight without always knowing why. The plantation lady's design had failed in the only way that truly mattered. It had not endured. What remained was truth, uneven and imperfect, but alive. And the house, stripped of authority and secrecy, stood empty beneath the Georgia sun, its open rooms filled not with whispers anymore, but with wind, carrying away the last traces of a legacy that had been built on silence and finally undone by being seen.